Letter came on a Wednesday. My brother's came on a Monday. 2 days apart. Same university. Same application cycle. And yet somehow, in the space of 48 hours, my family managed to decide that one of those letters mattered and one didn't. My brother's letter got taped to the refrigerator. Mine got left on the kitchen counter, face down, like it was junk mail. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm going to be here for a while. My brother Elliot is 2 years older than me. And for as long as I can remember, he has been the one my parents looked at when they talked about the future. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way you could point to and say, "Look, there it is, the moment everything changed." It was quieter than that. It was the way my father leaned forward when Elliot talked about his plans and leaned back when I talked about mine. The way my mother bought Elliot a new laptop for sophomore year of high school and told me to keep using the shared one in the living room. Small things. The kind of things that, when you name them out loud, sound like you're being too sensitive. I got good grades. Better than Elliot's, actually, though I learned early not to bring that up at dinner. I ran cross-country. I worked at a bakery on weekends and saved most of what I made because I had a feeling, even at 16, that I was going to need it. When I got into the same university as my brother, actually into the business program he'd been waitlisted for, I thought maybe this was the moment. Maybe this was the thing that would shift something. My father looked at the letter for a long time. Then he put it back on the counter and said, "How are you planning to pay for it?" I said I thought we'd figure it out together. Like a family. He said, "Your brother's scholarship only covers part of it. We're already stretched." Elliot's scholarship covered 40%. I know because I asked later, in a different conversation, when I was trying to understand the math. What I understood, eventually, was that there was no math. There was just a decision that had already been made before I even opened that letter. My parents were paying for my brother's education. Mine was a question I was supposed to answer myself. My mother said, when I pushed, "You've always been the capable one. You'll figure it out." She meant it as a compliment. I'm almost sure of that. But I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive home from the library that night, because the capable one is another way of saying you're on your own. And I hadn't been ready to hear that said so plainly. I deferred for a year, worked full-time at the bakery, picked up a second job doing data entry for a property management company on evenings and weekends. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I got 2 small ones. I took out loans for the rest. The week before I left for school, my parents took Elliot out for a farewell dinner. Steak place downtown, the one you need a reservation for. I heard them making the reservation for the hallway. Nobody mentioned me. I didn't know if I was supposed to be included and just hadn't been told, or if I genuinely wasn't part of the plan. I didn't ask. I made a grilled cheese at home and watched a movie by myself and told myself it didn't matter. It mattered. My first apartment was a room I rented from a woman named, well, she told me to call her by her first name, but she was 60-something and had a cat named General, and a strict policy about dishes in the sink. She charged me $400 a month, which was cheap, and she let me use her kitchen, which I needed because I couldn't afford a meal plan. I ate a lot of rice, a lot of eggs, a lot of whatever was on sale at the end of the week at the grocery store 2 blocks from campus. I had a system. If chicken was marked down on Sunday evening, that was protein for 3 days. I kept a spreadsheet. Every dollar. I carried 18 credits my first semester because I needed to stay on track for graduation. Without taking a 5th year, I couldn't afford. I had my bakery job on weekends, which I'd transferred to a location near campus, and I tutored intro accounting on Tuesday and Thursday evenings for $15 an hour. I slept about 5 hours a night, some nights less. My parents called occasionally. My mother would ask if I was eating enough, and I would say yes, and she would say good. And then we'd talk about Elliot for a while, how his internship was going, how his girlfriend was nice, how he'd finally gotten his car fixed. And then she'd say she had to go start dinner, and that was that. My father called less. When he did, it was usually to ask if I needed anything, in the tone of someone who was hoping the answer was no. The answer was always no. Not because I didn't need anything, because I'd learned that asking didn't work, and the effort of explaining what I needed cost more than just doing without. Thanksgiving my first year, I went home. I don't know why. I think I wanted to test it. Wanted to see if being in the same room again would feel any different now that I'd proven I could manage on my own. My mother made her usual spread. My aunt and uncle were there. My cousin who always asks about your relationship status. Elliot brought his girlfriend, who was perfectly nice and spent most of dinner talking to my mother about a renovation project. Nobody asked about school. Not once, the entire meal, did anyone turn to me and say, "How's it going? How are your classes? Are you managing okay?" Elliot mentioned that his professor had called him one of the strongest students in the seminar. My father looked like he'd won something. I drove back the next morning. It was a 4-hour drive. I stopped at a gas station outside of the city and sat in the parking lot for a while before I could make myself get back on the highway. I didn't go home for Thanksgiving again. The second year was harder in some ways and easier in others. Harder because I was tired in a way that it started to feel permanent. The way a noise you've been hearing for so long you stop noticing it is still there. Easier because I'd stopped expecting anything different. Expectation is exhausting. Letting it go was, in a strange way, a relief. I changed my major second semester of sophomore year, started in general business, ended up in finance, specifically because of a professor who taught an investments course and who had a habit of cold calling students and not accepting vague answers. I was terrified of him the first 3 weeks. Then I started doing extra reading before class, just so I'd have something real to say when he called on me. He noticed. After class one day, he stopped me and said I should consider the honors track. I said I'd think about it. I signed up the next morning. His name was, he told his students to call him by his last name. Just his last name, the way coaches do. He was the kind of teacher who made you feel like the work mattered because it actually did, not because he told you it did. I'd never had that before. I didn't know what to do with it at first. He wrote me a recommendation letter in my junior year. I don't know exactly what it said, but whatever it said was part of what eventually changed everything. I called home less as time went on. My mother noticed and said I seemed distant. I didn't know how to explain that I wasn't distant, I was just further away than she realized. Not geographically, but in some other way that I didn't have language for yet. Elliot graduated the spring of my sophomore year. My parents flew out for the ceremony. I saw the photos on the family group chat. My father had his hand on Elliot's shoulder and was smiling in the way he smiled in maybe 3 other photos I could remember from my whole childhood. I didn't say anything in the group chat. I think I liked the post. I'm not sure. Junior year. I applied for a competitive research fellowship, the kind that comes with a stipend and a faculty mentor, and, more importantly to me, a line on a resume that opens doors. There were 12 spots. The department got over 200 applications. I got in. I called my parents that evening. My mother said, "Oh, that's wonderful, honey." My father asked if it paid enough to cover my rent. I said it helped. He said that was good. I got off the phone and stood in my kitchen. I had my own apartment by then, a studio barely big enough for a bed and a desk, but mine, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. More like I recognized myself. Like I'd been looking for something, and had finally, in the quiet of that small room, found it. I ate cereal for dinner and went to bed at 9 and slept for 10 hours, which was the most I'd slept in 2 years. I want to tell you about the week before graduation, because I think it matters for understanding what came after. My mentor, the professor, called me into his office and told me that the committee had selected me as the college's student commencement speaker. Not the department. The whole college. I would be speaking at the main ceremony, in front of everyone. I sat in the chair across from his desk and didn't say anything for a moment. He said, "I know this is a lot, but you've earned it. Your thesis alone." And then he said some things about my thesis that I won't repeat, because they made me feel embarrassed in the way that being seen clearly sometimes does. I said I'd do it. I went home and wrote the speech over 3 evenings. I wrote about eating cereal for dinner. I wrote about the spreadsheet. I wrote about what it felt like to be told you're capable in a way that means you're on your own. I wrote about the Tuesday nights tutoring intro accounting for $15 an hour, and how the students I tutored sometimes seemed frustrated, and I would think, quietly, that I would have been grateful just for someone to sit across from me. I didn't name anyone, I didn't need to. My parents came to graduation. I hadn't told them about the speech. I told them I was graduating with honors, which was true and which I'd mentioned the month before, and my mother had said that was great, and asked if the ceremony would be outside because she ran warm. They arrived the morning of with my brother in tow. My aunt came too. It was more people than I'd expected, and for a moment, in the parking lot, before they saw me, I watched them as a group and felt that familiar thing. The outside-looking-in feeling I'd been carrying since I was 16. Then my mother saw me and waved, and I walked over and we did the hug thing. And my father said I looked tired and I said I was fine. And Elliot clapped me on the back and said congratulations, little sister, which he always says with this older sibling authority, even though we're not that far apart. And it landed the way it always does, somewhere between affectionate and diminishing. We walked to the venue together. I kept my face calm. I was very practiced at keeping my face calm. The ceremony opened with remarks from the dean. Then the department awards. Then the dean returned to the podium and said that this year's student commencement speaker had been selected by the faculty committee for academic distinction, research contribution, and, he paused here, the way people pause when they want the next words to land. Demonstrated resilience. He said my name. I heard my mother make a sound. Not a word, just a sound. I walked to the stage. I didn't look at my family. I looked at the podium, and then at the audience. And I took a breath, and I started to speak. I talked about the cereal. I talked about the cereal. I talked about the spreadsheet. I talked about sitting in a gas station parking lot on the way back from a Thanksgiving dinner where no one had asked about my life, and deciding that the drive back to school was the direction home. I talked about what it costs to do something alone, that was never supposed to be done alone, and what you find in yourself when the cost turns out to be something you can pay. I did not cry. I'd practiced until I could get through it without crying. I said, being capable is not the same as not needing anyone. It took me 4 years to understand that. I hope it takes you less time. I walked back to my seat. Afterwards, in the reception area, I was surrounded for a while. Classmates, professors, a few people I didn't know who shook my hand and said they'd be thinking about what I'd said. My mentor found me and said something quietly that I'll keep to myself. My family found me about 20 minutes in. My aunt hugged me for a long time. My brother said, genuinely, I didn't know. And I didn't know if he meant he hadn't known about the speech or hadn't known about the rest of it. And I nodded and let it be both. My father stood back a little. He had an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not pride exactly. Something more uncomfortable than pride. Something that looked like a man re-examining a calculation he thought he'd already finished. My mother took my arm and leaned close and said, quietly, "Was that about us?" I looked at her. I said, "It was about me." She held on to my arm for a moment. I let her. My father shook my hand. He said, "I didn't know it was this hard." He said it like a statement, but it came out like a question. And I didn't answer it because there wasn't an answer that would have helped either of us in that moment. We took photos. We went to lunch. We talked about where I was interviewing, which the fellowship had made considerably easier than I'd expected. We talked about Elliot's promotion. We talked about my aunt's kitchen renovation. I drove back to my studio apartment that evening and sat on my bed and looked at the wall for a while. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the ending of a story like this to feel like winning. And it doesn't really. It feels quieter, like something that needed to be witnessed finally, was, and now you can set it down. I had worked for 4 years doing something that was supposed to have been shared, and I had done it. and I had done it well enough that people I'd never met shook my hand and told me I'd said something true. That wasn't nothing. That was something I would carry for a long time, but it didn't fill the part that was still a little hollow. Success doesn't work that way. I understood that the top comment on this kind of story always says that, and the reason it gets so many likes is because it's true, and the reason it's true is because the hollow part isn't about achievement. It was never about achievement. It was about being a daughter who wanted to be seen before she had something to show. My parents and I talk more now than we did during those 4 years. My mother asks real questions sometimes, and I answer them honestly, and occasionally that's uncomfortable for both of us, and we do it anyway. My father said, about 6 months after graduation, that he'd been thinking about what I'd said in the speech, and that he'd been wrong about some things. He didn't list the things. I didn't ask him to. Elliot texted me the night of graduation, late after everyone had gone back to their hotels. He said, "I should have said something when we were kids. I don't know if it would have changed anything, but I should have." I thought about that text for a long time. I still think about it. I haven't fully decided what to do with it, and I've started to think that's okay, that not everything needs to be resolved to be real, and that some things take longer than a graduation speech to work through. What I know is this: I paid for my own education in every sense of that word. I paid in early mornings and spreadsheets and holidays spent driving away from instead of toward. I paid in nights when I was so tired I wasn't sure I was doing anything right, and mornings when I got up and did it anyway because there was no other option I was willing to take. And when my name was called and I stood at that podium and said, plainly, what those 4 years had actually cost. Not in dollars, but in the quieter currencies of loneliness and self-reliance and learning what home means when the original one doesn't quite hold you, I was paying it back to myself. That part felt like enough. Some days it still does. If you've been the one in your family who was told to figure it out, I want you to hear this. Capable is not a consolation prize. But it was never supposed to be the whole thing either. You deserved both. You still do. And wherever you are watching from, whatever time it is there, I'm glad you stayed. I've thought a lot about why things unfolded the way they did. Not in a bitter way. Or at least, not anymore. More like the way you turn an old object over in your hands and try to understand how it was made. My parents didn't set out to hurt me. I believe that. Genuinely. What they did was make a quiet, unconsidered decision that Elliot was the one worth investing in, and then never revisit it. They didn't ask themselves what that decision was teaching me, or what it was teaching him. They just moved forward the way people do when they haven't examined their own assumptions. And the cost of that unexamined assumption was paid entirely by me for 4 years in spreadsheets and 5-hour nights and holidays spent driving away. That's the thing about neglect that isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Every unanswered question, every dinner conversation that moved on without stopping at me, every phone call that ended on Elliot's news. None of those things were catastrophic on their own. Together they built something I had to carry for a long time before I understood what it weighed. And here's what I know about carrying heavy things. You get stronger, but you also get tired. The strength is real. The tiredness is also real. Both are allowed to be true at once. What kept me going wasn't rage, and it wasn't some grand vision of proving anyone wrong. It was smaller than that. It was a professor who cold called me and expected a real answer. It was a landlady with a cat named General who charged me $400 a month and let me use her kitchen without making me feel like a charity case. It was the students I tutored on Tuesday and Thursday evenings who sometimes seemed frustrated, and me thinking quietly that I would have been grateful just for someone to sit across the table from me and explain the thing I didn't understand. Those small dignities, extended by people who owed me nothing, were what kept the lights on inside me when my own family had decided the bill wasn't theirs to pay. That is its own kind of cause and effect. You extend dignity to someone who is running low, and something in them continues. It doesn't make the original wound smaller, but it proves that the wound is not the whole story. My mentor used to say that intelligence without integrity is just cleverness, And cleverness without endurance is just potential. He meant it as academic advice. I took it as something larger, because what I learned in those 4 years wasn't just finance, and it wasn't just how to survive on rice and eggs and whatever was marked down on Sunday evening. I learned that character is not what you are when things are given to you. It's what you become when they aren't. I stood at that podium and said what was true clearly in front of everyone, including the people who hadn't believed I would get there. That took something I hadn't known I had until I needed it. And if my parents hadn't made the decision they made, I don't know if I ever would have found out what I was capable of building with my own hands. I'm not grateful for the hardship. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to dress up neglect as a gift, but I am clear-eyed about what it taught me, and I carry that without bitterness most days. You are not defined by what your family chose not to give you. You are defined by what you chose to do next.